and I'm joined by my podcast partner, Tom Laidlaw, the former NHL defenseman for the New York Rangers and Los Angeles Kings. And this is the Laidlaw and Allen Report coming to you twice a week. And Tom, John Tortorella, to no one's surprise, lost it after last night's game when his team lost in a shootout. And I'm sure you've got some thoughts on what transpired. Give us a blow by blow on what happened, and then we'll discuss our thoughts on John's conduct after the game.
So I guess into overtime, a penalty was called. And apparently, as he said, he looked up at the clock and it was 19.2 seconds, I believe, left in the period when the whistle blew. But the clock continued to go down to 18.1 seconds. He tried to point that out to the referees and to have the NHL office in New York or in Toronto take a look at it and see if they could get the clock back to where it was supposed to be based on his opinion. They would not. I think what really frustrated him more than anything was the referees apparently said they just weren't going to do it. They didn't agree with them. They weren't going to go back and turn the clock back. They had a scoring opportunity that was taken away from them. Actually, they scored a goal, but the clock had expired. And so now they go into a shootout, and their goaltender was hurt during the shootout. So he's mad that the clock was not corrected properly. He's mad that they didn't even address it with all the technology that was there. He's mad that the goal was disallowed. And then he was also mad that they lost his goaltender. And he was very clear, very succinct. It was amazing with him. You could tell he's mad, but it wasn't like he was out of control. He was totally in control, explained why he was so mad. My first takeaway with him is usually he's the kind of guy that doesn't make any excuses for his team. If his team loses a game, he'll say, we should have done more to win that game. Clearly, this was right after all this happened, so he was a little heated, but he was very, as mad as he was really under control and really stated his argument pretty clearly.
That's a really good point, Tom. One that I hadn't thought about was it was a very controlled explosion.
Yes. Yeah.
He knew he wanted to make a point and he said it. And, I'm not, I'm a little sympathetic to his point on that.
Yeah.
Like, we all watch the NFL, and the NFL is very careful about when, a play happens and there's an overruling. You always hear the referee saying, we're going to roll back the clock 6 seconds. Yep. Because they go back and they check it on the television. And they see exactly at what point the infraction occurred, and they go back and give that time up. With the technology, as John pointed out, we have today, there's really no reason not to do that.
Yeah.
What do we always say? We just want to get it right. So, yep. but saying all that, here's my issue with it all. I don't like the argument about had they rolled back the clock, his goalie wouldn't have gotten injured, because now you're kind of talking sort of a metaphysical sort of thing. Like, you don't know what would have happened, and, it could have been worse. Someone, could have broken a leg, or, you just don't know, what would have happened. So I'm not sure I totally agree that it would have been totally different, but I think his point about, getting the time is right. Now, I guess what I really want to talk about, and this is what I always like about being on a podcast with a former NHL player, because you can take us into this mindset. I figure that John Tortorella did this for a variety of reasons. Number one, he's John Tortorella, and that's how he reacts to things. Number two, I think he wanted to show his players, hey, look, I'm standing up for you. You played a hard game. You should have won it. Let's do that. And even though a hockey coach has never said this to me, I've had basketball coaches tell me on multiple occasions that the reason they get into it and mix it up with officials is they want the next call, and they figure if they're always raising Cain, the next time the official comes into your building, he's going to realize, boy, I better make sure I'm on my toes and get everything done exactly right, because otherwise Tortorella will explode on me. And I don't want to be embarrassed. So I don't know if that's, part of his thinking and why he does that. I think a lot of it is his personality. And I also think there was an element of frustration. That division is tough. His team is 17-14. His goalie has done all he can this season. Korpisalo, this injury didn't look good. They've already called up somebody. and I think he knows what a tough fight it's going to be in that division if he's got to go for an extended period. And I think there was some frustration there.
Yeah. I definitely agree with the frustration. And I think you're right. It's, maybe get the next call that comes their way. And I also think it's a little bit of that us against the world mentality, right? I think he did that early in the year, actually before the season started and all those free agents left. Now everybody's this depleted lineup. We all feel sorry for ourselves. And he didn't want that. He said, no, we're going to do this. It's us against everybody else. Nobody else believes in us. And now here's another opportunity to say to even the league, I know he didn't use these words. The league is, not being fair to us, like we got to fight, we got to band together even more. That's the John Tortorella kind of stuff. So, but you're right. He's frustrated, but I think both of us agree it was that controlled frustration. So it kind of tells you that he really had a purpose to what he was doing there too. So,
yeah. The other question is, have we reached the point when John Tortorella is, everybody just kind of yawns when he does this now. It's kind of like the boy that cried wolf.
Yeah.
We've seen explosions before, and does the league look at this and say, boy, we ought to look at this and make sure we get it right, or they go, oh boy, John's off again. I don't have an answer for that, but he
has toned it down though, right? I mean, it's not as bad as it used to be.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think he's a good coach. I always have.
Yeah,
I feel he gets a lot out of his players, and I have talked to, even though he's explosive, and he's been tough on some players. I've talked to a number of players who played for him who really enjoyed the experience. They think he really cares for them, and I'll give you an example. Seth Jones, I remember last season talking to him, and he just said, "Hey, look, I like playing for John. He keeps me on my toes, and he said we have good, honest, frank discussions. You never in the dark, what he wants from you. And I think he's effective. I go back to his days. I think he probably was at his worst with Tampa, and yet he still took them to a cup.
Yeah.
Because he was just way over the line back then. He was just, constantly in players' faces, and he was too explosive. With the Rangers, I thought he got a lot out of that team when he was there.
Totally.
I didn't think that team was good enough, and I think he kind of made it better. And I think he's done an okay job in Columbus.
Absolutely. No, listen, I compare him a lot in a lot of ways to Herb Brooks. Herb was the same way. Herb always, you didn't like him too much when you're playing sometimes, but you look back now and how much more you got out of your career. And for me, like the things I'm doing now in my life with True Grit Life and everything, he's taught me a lot about that stuff, how to get the most out of yourself. Don't settle for being whatever you are. Always go to strive to be better. I do think the one we should have a new rule, though, that the GM should probably look into this summer. Try to make sure that at every press conference, Larry Brooks from the New York Post is at his press conference that John Tortorella had. I think that would really make things a lot better.
Yeah, no, it would have been there. What's fascinating about that is John Tortorella does rarely, I don't know that I've ever saw him make a statement before he takes questions. He's not one of those guys that just starts talking, like Mike Babcock would, or, Hitchcock, or those players from that era, the guys who are kind of mediagenic. Tortorella just comes in and just waits for someone to ask him something he doesn't like.
And it doesn't matter what they ask him, though. He's going to answer the question the way he wants, though, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So for him to come in, also speaks to how calculated it is. And like they're in a mess now. Like, they ended up, last summer they signed the goalie they call Elvis, and he was the best goalie in the world. That's what people said outside the NHL. He had played very well over in Europe, and he's come in and he hasn't played all that well. I think he's had 7 starts and really hasn't performed all that well. So I'm sure there's I have no idea what the injury is, but it didn't look good. If you were watching the game. Yeah. He couldn't put any weight on that leg, he being Korpisalo. Yep. And so I'm sure there's, concern there as well. But it was, another interesting night. I like I think the Blue Jackets are a hard team to play against. I think that's because of Tortorella. And I kind of root for them because they went for it last year and everybody thought it was the wrong move. And I like general managers who push all their chips in and say, look, I want to make the playoffs, because that's what we're here for. I'm not fooling around with tanking or everything. We're playing to win here in Columbus. So I admired the moxie. I understand the argument of why you wouldn't do it, but to me, sports are I'm trying to win this next game.
Especially in Columbus, and they never won a playoff round, right? I mean, so
yeah.
Make that statement. I agree with you totally. And you know what I like too is you can do it when you really worked hard to develop your stock to shells. Make sure you got a lot of young players coming up. And even though they had to give up assets to get those players, it appears they still got a lot of good young assets still to come. So if you've done your work to prepare for that, then you can get away with it. Yep.
Well, and they didn't get Bobrovsky, but they believed in Korpisalo, and he's done fine. I don't think he's an all-world goalie, but he's not the worst goalie in the league either. He's played and performed well enough for them to believe they had a shot at making the playoffs. And now all this kind of goes down. But anyway, let's move on to a couple other subjects. I wanted to ask you about Kreider. I know you pay attention a lot to the Rangers because you're involved and you do a lot of work for that organization. There's been a lot of rumblings that they're kind of zeroing in on a possible trading site. I'm not saying that it's imminent, but I've kind of heard that the Rangers have put it out that if they're going to trade Kreider, they're going to, as a minimum, want a first-round draft pick and a young player who can come back and step into the lineup. And I've heard that Colorado and Boston, two teams that you and I have talked about, are in that mix, and the St. Louis Blues, who really believe they can make them run in another Stanley Cup, and why not? Yep. They have all the same ingredients that they had, last season. So, kind of what's your thought on that? If you had to put a percentage on it, what do you think it is? 70-30 that'll be traded, or is it even higher? I don't know.
I'm looking at the standings right now, and the Rangers have got 42 points. So they're 6 points behind Carolina for a wild card spot, and I think they've got a game in hand too, or a couple of games in hand. Here's the thing with the Rangers. I know everybody looks and says, okay, here's where they're at now, and they're out of a playoff spot. But the first probably quarter of the season, they had a terrible start to the season. I think they played 2 games in the first 10 days where they just never got into it. Now they're getting all these young players into their lineup. They're trying to get their feet wet in the National Hockey League. They'll have one good night, 2 bad nights, 2 good nights, 1 bad night. That's the nature of the beast with young players. And now when you watch them play, man, they had a great game against Carolina at home. They went into Toronto and gave up the lead to Toronto, went into overtime and beat Toronto in Toronto. Toronto's been on a roll, playing well, scoring lots of goals. This Ranger team I see, to me, is just getting better and better all the time. These young players are getting more accustomed to playing in the National Hockey League. I can see the argument that if you can't lose Kreider for nothing and just let him go as a free agent, so you've got to get something back if you don't think you can get him signed. But the other side of it is that I think this team's going to make the playoffs. I think they're good enough to make the playoffs. I think they're well coached enough to get good enough goaltending. And again, I think the key is that these young players are going to continue to get better and better. I guess you could argue that if you take Kreider out of the lineup, yes, you're losing a very valuable player, but somebody else is going to step up and get additional ice time, right? And now you've got these young players coming up to make you even better down the road. So I can see why you do it. I like Kreider a lot. The frustrating thing for him sometimes is that he is so good and so talented. You see it a lot of the times, but sometimes when you don't see it, you get a little frustrated. Think, geez, why aren't we getting that all the time? But that's all players. Not everybody plays the best all the time. So I like him a lot as a player. I agree that if they're going to trade him, they better get something really good for him. If they're not going to get something really good for him, then I think they'd be comfortable in keeping him in the lineup, because again, I really believe this team is a playoff team. And I think they're getting better and better all the time. And I think he's a big, important part of the team.
One thing about this that I'm, and I've noticed this around the league, and it bothers me. Like, we talk all the time about the NHL is getting younger and faster, and there's no doubt about that. They're giving more opportunities to the guys who can really skate, because they really want that up tempo and they want to push it. And I think, it goes beyond speed creates chaos, doesn't it, Tom? On the ice, isn't that why we like it so much? When everybody's flying around the ice, things happen. Pucks take weird bounces. A defenseman stumbles because he's got to react just a little bit quicker than he has. So we're doing all that. But now we talk about in rebuilding everything. Like, Chris Kreider's 28 years old, and he's a very consistent scorer. I just looked it up, and he's had 5 or 6 seasons where he has scored 20 or more goals. And I know your argument about the inconsistency because it feels like Kreider should be a 30-goal scorer.
Yes.
And he's never reached that.
Yep.
He's had 28 twice, including last season. But, have we reached the point where a 28-year-old can't be included in rebuild because, it just seems like, and everybody kind of operates like that if you aren't 23 or 24 when you're rebuilding, well, you're just over the hill. And, and then I look at Zdeno Chara playing when he's over 40.
Yes.
So
look at that. To me, Boston is the perfect example of how to do a rebuild. Yeah, I mean, it isn't always possible. You don't always have Zdeno Chara. You don't always have Patrice Bergeron in your lineup. But when they did the rebuild, they kept those guys. They kept Krejci in the lineup too. They did the rebuild, but they were in a position to have, like, they said themselves, we need these older character players to show the young kids how to play. I mean, you look at the Edmonton Oilers and the struggles they've had and all the first overall draft picks and first round draft picks they have go through there, and they haven't been able to put it all together. And to me, a large part of it is that they just haven't had that culture that we talk about so much. Boston is about culture. Zdeno Chara, Patrice Bergeron, those guys, the work ethic, the professionalism. And in places like Edmonton, they haven't had that there. So these young kids are coming in. They're 18 years old, 19 years old, coming in and playing the National Hockey League. Fantastic players. Work ethic is incredible. You have to learn along the way. And if you don't have those older players there to show them the way, like in Zdeno Chara talking about how there'll be no hazing. There's no initiation on this team. You're part of this team. You're part of this team. Doesn't matter if you're a first-year player or a 15-year player. Those little things about the team and how to build the team are so important. So I agree with you. I mean, I did, and I think Kreider is like that. Like he's not a Zdeno Chara, but like he is his work ethic is like he almost works too hard. I think sometimes they wish they could throw him out of the training center because he's there all the time. His work ethic is just impeccable. So I'm with you. I think at 28 years old, that's why, and I think it's a tough spot for the Rangers because and I think maybe a tough spot, but maybe a good spot. Either you get what you want for him or you keep him. Either way, you're going to benefit.
Yeah. I think he could still be an effective player, for a long time. But, you were talking about the Bruins. I know how much you like them. And I was thinking before we went on the air here that I wonder, like, if I said to you, Tom, I will give you, we're going to make a bet. We're going to bet, $100. And I'll give you any 3 teams in the league that you can take, and then I get the rest. I get the field after you take your 3. Okay. Now, here's my argument. I think even if I said that to you and you can pick any 3 you want, I think I'm still favored to win just because of the parity in the NHL. But saying that, I'm curious to see whether my 3 and your 3 would be the same.
Okay.
So let's
simple for me: Washington, Boston, and St. Louis.
Yeah, that's what I have as well. Those are the 3 I would take, and I think it's the same reason is we know all 3 of those teams can win because they have.
Yes.
So,
you know what, you're right, but it's also how they've won. Like, Tampa had that great regular season last year, and I'm not high on them just because they lost in the playoffs. I'm not as high on them because I just don't see that same culture that Boston's got, that Washington's got, that St. Louis has got, that gritty culture. Guys get hurt, next man up mentality. I just when I see Kucherov getting benched by the coach, as a star player. I mean, like Patrice Bergeron never gets benched, right? He's your leader, not just because of how good he is, because of his work ethic and his preparation. So that's why, to me, those 3 teams were just head and shoulders above everybody else.
Yeah, speaking of that, I mean, I've spoken about this before, and I've actually used Cooper as an example about, the kind of the modern coach. And I think the modern coach who's, it used to be you kind of did things as a coach because that was kind of the tradition of the sport. And I actually think now there's been a lot of discussion. We have symposiums on coaching and seminars, and, Roger Nielsen was ahead of his time in that regard because he wanted to talk about, the strategy and the logistics of coaching and so forth. And I think the modern coach is what I see is kind of like John Cooper. Like, he's still a tough coach. Yep. He'll bench guys, and, he's had some tension with Stamkos over, where he was playing and so forth. But he's such a good communicator is that I don't think players feel threatened. Like, I don't think that anyone's afraid to pop. I mean, could be wrong. Maybe someone will tell me, but I just don't see, based on my observation, that a player would be timid about going into his office and sitting down and talking about, what's going on with him or the team or anything else, because I think he's very approachable.
Yep.
And and he's not alone. There are other guys in the league that are like that. And I think, that's the, when we talked before about what had happened with Peters and the Babcock and kind of the old school guys, I think some of that is eroding just because the modern guys have been so well trained, and they, for lack of a better phrasing, I think there's a better understanding of the psychology of, kind of coaching. But, Bruce Cassidy is another guy that I think fits into that mold as well, where I think, he seems tough enough. I think he gets a lot out of his players and he demands a lot out. But I would argue that most players would feel very comfortable, no matter what was going on, walking in and saying, Bruce, this is why I'm doing this. And there might be some give and take, the coach is always going to be right. But did you feel you could have give and take with Herbie? I'm guessing not.
Yeah. Well, with Herb, yeah. Herb was a different guy in front of everybody than he was one-on-one, right? Herb did a lot of things to send messages to other players through other players. He would treat me one way, he would treat Barry Beck another way. He understood who we were. It was, you watch the movie Miracle, and that's who Herb Brooks was. He was to the extreme in the movie. But I agree with you. I think the communication when I first started was just, I had Freddie Shero, and I loved him to death. He got my start in the National Hockey League, but he just didn't communicate. There was no communication. I knew I made the hockey team when he told me I could get a place to stay. There was no sitting down and giving you this speech about how, man, Tom, you finally made it to the National Hockey League. It was like, okay, Tom, you can get an apartment. That was it. There's no, you knew you were playing well because you got played. If you weren't playing well, you didn't get played. That was pretty simple. There was no explanation. You didn't ever feel like, especially as a younger player, the thought of even, the culture was, the thought of even going in and talking to the coach was like, no, you don't talk to the coach. You just go play hockey. And I think that's wrong. I remember one time I think I told a story before, but Robbie Fatorik, he was a really great friend of mine. I admire him so much. He was coaching in LA. And we had a player who wasn't getting played very much. He went in to talk to Robbie, and Robbie flat out just told him he just didn't like him as a player. There was no game playing or whatever. He told him, he was very clear. And the player was upset about it. And I said, listen, I can understand why you're upset, but it's pretty honest. There's no confusion there, right? That's, where you stand with the player, with the coach now. So, that was one case with Robbie, but I agree with you. I think as time's gone on, the communication has got better and better and I think it's important for players. There's sometimes as a player, you look back and you go like, I just didn't know what was going on. I just want to play. So I guess in some ways that was good. Just keep it simple, stupid, and keep playing. But nowadays these kids are different. They're much more educated, much more aware of the rights of the game and under the collective bargaining agreement, all the issues that come with being a player. So I think these guys are a whole different group of players than they were when I played.
Tom, I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things at the World Junior Championship, and I want to launch that discussion with a story. When I lost my job at USA Today a couple of weeks ago, I got a lot of emails from a lot of people in the industry, including some readers. And one guy pointed out that he said that he wanted to thank me for introducing him because he lives in, I believe actually it was in Connecticut. But anyway, that I introduced him to the World Junior Championship. Then he said he had no idea what it was 25 or 30 years ago. And then I just started writing about it because I thought, these are, and I always had to include a paragraph because I was writing in America to explain what it was. I had to say, look, this is the best teenage players in the world. And most of the top stars in the NHL played in this tournament, prior to coming to the NHL. And I would explain that every year. And he said, he just appreciates that. And back in the old days in America, you just couldn't get, any video of what was happening over there. And I used to, kind of cover it by calling the coaches there. And then a couple of times I went, but, it wasn't a priority when I was covering the NHL. But now we can see all the games thanks to the, NHL Network, and we get, all the games. And now, I think even in America, although it's not as crazy in Canada, But that's where I want to start. First of all, explain to our listeners, particularly those in America, like how big this is in Canada.
Well, okay, so hockey in Canada, although maybe it's not as much as it used to be, but it's much more than the fabric of the nation. It's like a religion almost. Like it's something that in the past when I was growing up there that we felt like we owned hockey. We created hockey. It didn't matter what the facts were. It's like hockey was Canada. Canada was hockey. Every Saturday night sitting in front of Hockey Night in Canada on CBC and watching the hockey game, Montreal Canadiens, wherever it was. That's Canada was hockey. So when you get to the World Junior Tournament, it's the same thing. Canada viewed it that we developed players better than anybody else in the world. So this was a tournament to show that we developed better players, and the pressure on the young kids to win. And I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of years where Canada didn't have the most talented lineup. It just meant so much to these kids to win that they would do anything to win. It meant more to them than the other countries. Now that's started to change a little bit. You see the U.S., Sweden, Finland, Russia, these other countries now where it's Czechoslovakia, where it's just as important to them to win the tournament too. So the level of intensity is cranked up. So it's it's the holidays. People are they've got time off, so they're sitting around the TV watching a morning game from someplace. So it's a big deal to the Canadians. But I'll tell you, they've been humbled a little bit the last few years too, with the success of the U.S. right next door. And these other countries that have done so well, Sweden and Finland, and it shows at the draft too, with these young kids getting drafted so high. So it is a big deal in Canada.
Yeah, the ratings are incredible, the number of people. And I used to kind of compare it to bowl watching in the U.S., but that doesn't really fit as well as I would like it to, because I think the dedication in Canada to watching these games and making it a part of your kind of holiday traditions a little bit stronger than bowls. You watch bowls because they're on, where I don't think you plan your life around them. And I think people do plan their life around watching the World Juniors in Canada. And I want to talk a little bit about what's actually happening this year. And I know, Tom, you didn't see it, but Joe Veleno, who's a Detroit Red Wings prospect, a guy that Steve Yzerman really seemed to like when he showed up here. He's a 200-foot center, has struggled a little bit. They sent him to the minors and really has been, probably hasn't performed quite as well as the Red Wings had hoped. But I don't think that's changed their opinion. They think he's going to be an NHL player. But in the World Junior Championship, international rules are different, as we all know, anybody who's watched the Olympics. But they have a headbutting rule. And Joe Veleno came over, and an opposing player, and we've seen it 100 times in the NHL. Two guys come together, and there's a helmet-to-helmet bonk that happens. You lean forward, and you go helmet to helmet. Tom, have you ever done that in your life? Or 1,000 times you've done that, where you just get close, and you're just telling the guy what's going on.
Yeah, my nose would get in the way though. But.
Yeah, mine for sure if I was doing that. Anyway. So Joe Veleno does this in the international competition. Now, word had sort of leaked out that there was going to be a suspension, and some people thought it was going to be for Barrett Hayton because of the fact he didn't take his helmet off during the Russian national anthem. And really, it was embarrassing, to be honest. I don't know what he was thinking. Now, he explained that he was already starting to think about the next game, and he just didn't think it through. And Canada apologized for it. And, these are young kids. Maybe that's exactly what happened. Maybe it wasn't a form of protest. Maybe he's just thinking, oh, my gosh, we lost. We were embarrassed by Russia. Now how do I get this team up? I mean, he is the captain. But people thought, well, is he going to get suspended? Because the rumors were out. But it was actually Veleno who was suspended for what they called and what they referred to as headbutting. That he put his head down, and he did indeed, if you by the definition of the rule, and that's what they hung their in this case helmet on, was the fact that he did indeed headbutt by definition. He lowered his head and he tapped the guy. There was, now, as they even said when they had a suspension, there was no danger that the opposing player was going to be injured by this, but they just wanted to live by the letter of the law. I thought it was probably one of the most ridiculous rulings I've ever seen. To give someone a suspension just because it fits the definition of the rule when that was clearly not a headbutt by any stretch of the imagination. I thought it was kind of a silly gesture.
Right. And a World Junior Championship where it's such a big tournament, a young kid, they're young kids are going to, cross the line, make little mistakes sometimes. Like the guy, not taking his helmet off is clearly a mistake. Looking back at it. So I just think to do that to a young player so he misses time because he just tapped the other guy's helmet. I guess I can see they're going to say, well, listen, we need to show these kids that we have a rule book. And that's it. So it's not going to be we're not going to be a little lenient on somebody else and then call the penalty on somebody else later on down the road. So I guess you could see the argument, but I'm with you. Yeah, you've got to use common sense, I think. And it's a huge tournament for these kids. They've traveled a long way. Their families are there, or they're representing their country, and to have them not be able to play because of a minor mistake like that is wrong. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. One final thing before we close it off. Lafreniere, who's expected to be the number one draft pick this season, he was injured for Team Canada. And, they're kind of treating this cautiously. And, Tom, you've been there before. You're also, in addition to being a former player, a former agent. You had Brian Berard, who was projected number one. I mean, do you support this idea that, it's better to err on the side of caution here with this injury, given his status as a player?
Absolutely. And I think anybody that sends those kids over there knows that, they can't start. First of all, just for this player, you've got to do the right thing for him, make sure that he is safe and healthy before he gets back in the lineup. But you also want to show the kids that are coming up in the future, the high draft picks, that they're going to be treated properly when they go over that tournament. So totally, they need to be very careful. From all the reports I've seen, apparently he was walking around without any support on his knee or whatever, so it doesn't seem to be that bad. But I agree with you. Give it a rest until you know that he's healthy, or at least close to healthy as possible. That thought that you would put him back in the game, injure the knee even more, and hurt his chances in the draft and his future career, it's just wrong. And most countries handle it that way, so I'm not concerned at all.
Yeah, that's the way I would. If he had said, if his agent or his family said, "Look, we'd like to go back and have a specialist look back in the United States," I'd say, yep, more power to you. That's what you need to do. And who knows? Maybe you'll find out something good, and you'll be back on a plane coming over. But I thought this has been handled correctly as well. You can't risk a long-term situation.
One quick thing I'd like to point out. I'd just like to note that we've gone through a whole podcast here. You have not mentioned Barry Trotz or the New York Islanders once.
Well, that's my New Year's resolution.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah, no Barry Trotz.
All right, we'll see about that. We'll see.
I'll probably get to January 2nd, maybe. All right, you've been listening to the Laidlaw and Allen Report. I'm Allen. He's Laidlaw. We'll be back later this week.
See you next year.